I am currently the owner of 2 Darksabers, and that is one too many. So today, all of you will be getting the chance to win my Malibu Darksaber. It is currently uninstalled, but includes an empty Sabertrade blade, the blade connectors, as well as the empty hilt. And no, you do not have to fight me for it. Simply like this video, subscribe to my channel, and comment, "This is the way," down below. Within reason, I will pay to ship the hilt and blade to the winner anywhere in the world. Any customs fees would be the responsibility of the recipient. The entry period will be open for 1 week from the posting time of this video. A winner will be randomly selected from the entrance, and I will make an announcement here on the channel. Now, to business. Today I will be installing the Justin Marshall Saberbay Darksaber. I did the chassis and the hilt prep ahead of time for this video, so if you have any questions on how something goes together or how I achieved a certain look, feel free to ask in the comments. Now, if you've seen my install videos before, you know I like to start with a visual inventory of parts. And you know I'll remind you to take your SD card out while soldering. Making sure you have everything before you start is important, since it sucks to get partway into your build and realize you don't have all your components. And what's the easiest way to keep track of your necessary parts? Referencing your wiring diagram, of course. And your wiring diagram doesn't need to be fancy. It just needs to show each of your parts and the correct paths for their electrical connections. That's it. I'm going to start into this build by pre-tinning each of the pads I intend to use on my Profi board. I personally like to give the pads enough solder so that making the wire connection later doesn't require me to have too much solder on my iron. With that little warm-up done, I'm going to be wiring up my speaker. In order to size my wire runs, I just cut the wires a little longer than necessary based on how far they need to travel through the chassis. And for wiring the speaker, keep in mind that one of your wires may need to be longer depending upon the orientation of the speaker. Sometimes you'll see people skip pre-tinning their wires and components. The fact is though, good pre-tinning leads to easier soldering. For new installers especially, be careful soldering to your speakers. As soon as the solder is molten and your wire is submerged, get your iron off the pad, as too much heat can cause the pad to detach from the speaker. And then make sure the pad has solidified again before moving things, because there's quite a bit of solder there and it takes a couple of seconds to cool. Next up, I'm wiring my battery negative tab. The wire can be oriented the other way, I was just doing something odd there. With the tab in place, I can set the speaker into the chassis. I did add a little E6000 later to glue it securely in place. To keep the wires neat and tidy behind the battery, you can just use heat shrink. However, I wanted mine to look a little fancier, so after adding heat shrink to protect from short circuits, I added braided metal wire loom. Though you can buy this stuff in bulk, if you only need a small amount, I suggest getting some from Smuggler's Outpost. I'll link it in the parts list that you can find down in the description. You can also get it in plastic, but I think the metal really helps complete the look on this build. Here is something that you should never skip on your installs, and that is labeling your wires. You can do it with tape labels on each wire, or you can have a color-coded diagram that helps keep them all straight. However you do it, just be 100% sure which wire is which when you make your final connections. If you connect power and something is wired incorrectly, you may end up replacing parts before you can finish your build, and that sucks even worse than forgetting to acquire them. Since the ends of this metal braid are a bit messy, I'm putting a small piece of heat shrink over each side. It not only cleans up the look, but also protects the battery and battery contacts from short circuits. And then one last addition to the battery compartment. I felt like the little gap next to the wires needed to be filled, so I painted a wood skewer with chrome marker and pressed it into place. Moving on to the positive battery tab, I'll wire it up much the same as the negative, feed it into place, and then glue it down. The positive tab is much more necessary to have well adhered to the chassis, and just a touch of superglue or E6000 will do the trick. Possibly the single most important function of a multimeter to know for saber building is continuity. In continuity mode, an audible beep and/or resistance reading is given in ohms if the 2 points are electrically connected. Multimeters that don't have continuity mode can be set to resistance, which is essentially the same function minus the beep. When testing for electrical connection in resistance mode, a very low reading such as 0 or just a couple ohms indicates a closed electrical path. Closed, in electrical terms, means that electricity can travel through it. For practical application, we'll test our kill switch, which has 2 positions and 3 contacts. You'll notice that the center contact or leg is the common one, and it is connected to the other 2 based on what position the switch is in. And in continuity mode, the multimeter gives us the audible beep to indicate our closed electrical path. Now if we switch to resistance mode, you'll see that we get a reading of 0 ohms from the closed position. However, the open position gives no reading at all, and that indicates there is no continuity or no electrical path between those contacts. Then if we move the switch to the opposite position, we can see that there is now an electrical path present there. Knowing this, and knowing that I only need one of those outside legs, I like to remove the one that's not in use. This isn't absolutely necessary, but I always try to reduce any possibility of accidental short circuits. With one of my leads attached, I'm going to solder the switch to my battery before inserting it in the chassis. This wire is coming from my battery positive tab. I'll cut it to an appropriate length to reduce excess wire, that way it takes up the least space possible. It takes extra consideration and more patience to solder the shorter leads, but it pays off big time in the area of good wire management. It's also a very good idea to put heat shrink on at least one of the switch legs to prevent potential short circuits. Once soldering is completed, the switch can be press fit into place. If there's not enough friction to hold the switch in place, just add some E6000. If you've watched my videos before, then you know that I love splicing wires with Y joints. Stripping the wire can be tricky, however, as you have to be careful not to cut any strands. This Y joint is for my accent pixels, and I definitely could have used a smaller gauge here. I think I'll splice that on later. Next, I'm pre-tinning my OLED screen. This takes 4 wires to get it hooked up and running, and the wire runs are pretty short as it sits right next to the board and the chassis. As with all PCBs, you really should clean up the flux residue with isopropyl alcohol and a Q-tip, or whatever your choice tools may be. Short circuits from flux may be uncommon, but they absolutely can occur. Don't forget to remove the screen film on the OLED, it looks tacky as hell to leave it on there. Once the screen is in place, just use a couple small dabs of E6000 to keep it in. I'm putting a little on each side at opposing corners. Now with Hilt side connector PCBs, I found that my preferred installation method is clamping the edge of the board and inserting the pins so that gravity keeps them in. I'll say that I've done this with long pins as well, but I would advise using a second PCB or a pin guide is a good idea for keeping your pins straight when soldering. Excuse the E6000, the stray fabric thread on my tweezers, and my shaking hand. I just wanted to illustrate that these pins are spring-loaded, and as such you must be careful not to get solder inside of them. If you do, the pin will lock up and be no good for use in blade connection. The key is applying the flat of your iron completely to the back of the pin and feeding just enough solder to make a nice shiny dome over the pin. Once you reach that amount, do not continue adding solder. Do this for each pin and you'll be golden. If you accidentally bridge a couple pads, no big deal, just clean off your iron tip, swipe it away. After that, I'm pre-tinning my crystal chamber pixel and then soldering data and power wires to it. As with the rest of your wires, make sure you cut them long enough to reach the appropriate pads on your board. Inserting this pixel into its holder takes some work to get the right fit, so I just used a small file and removed any excess material until it snapped into place. When I solder wires to my blade connector, I like to put 90-degree bends in them prior to soldering. This helps a lot with routing and reducing stress on the joints. With the connector in place in the holder, you can see that the pins compress just below flush with the edge. This is exactly what you want to see. The wires can be fed through from the emitter side of the guard, and the holder can be inserted into this portion of the hilt. The blade plug can be used to press it into place or to get a depth check. Once it is in all the way, the chassis can be attached from the other side, and then the emitter can slide onto the guard. 2 screws are used to fasten all these parts together, one on each side. Get them very snug, but absolutely do not over tighten them. Now to work on the switch PCB. It's very important when clamping on circuit boards to be careful not to clamp on small components. The SMD components and their joints are very delicate. I'm pre-tinning my switch PCB, which houses 2 accent pixels as well as my activation and auxiliary switches. As I get everything soldered here, you may notice I'm running my data and power for the NeoPixels in and out of the PCB. My recommendation is not to do that. There is barely enough room for that many 30 gauge wires, and there are definitely smarter wire runs, but it worked out fine for me in the end. You'll see here that I'm splicing my power lead to the blade connector with a simple joint. What's even simpler than the joint itself is forgetting your heat shrink, so make sure you don't. And now I'm just making all of my connections from the components to the board. Being quick and accurate with this part of the soldering takes a lot of practice, and most of my joints come out really nice, but I won't pretend that it's not a challenge to work around my camera and lens. There are occasions where I have a tough angle with the lens in the way, and I have to redo a joint. The key is to be patient and steady, and absolutely take the time to rework any unsatisfactory joints. And if your gut tells you it isn't right, then redo it. You can see that to bridge those LED pads, I just left my wire long enough to span both of them. And I know you've probably heard it a lot in my other videos, but always trim your exposed wires so that it does not overhang the intended pad or pads. Now I have this strip of 5 size 2020 pixels, and I've used 3M double-coated tissue tape to adhere it to my Profi board. I absolutely love this tape and I highly recommend it. Soldering these joints is a bit tricky, but I just took my time with it. I really like that the black color of the pixel strip and wires blends well with the Profi board. It makes the install look clean, even with them mounted on top. And you may not see it every step of the way, but just like stripping wires and pre-tinning, I am always cleaning PCBs before applying power to them. At this point, the soldering is complete and the SD card can be reinserted. Also, mind your battery polarity as you don't want to fry your electronics. I always say it, but this part honestly never gets old. I have this really interesting mesh I found inside of a laptop I disassembled. It was the internal speaker compartment cover. So I've added that for some visual interest, and it sits over the board just below the metal crystal chamber. This thing looks so freaking good. Just the installed chassis displayed like this is beautiful. Okay, let's get a few glamour shots here to wrap up. I got my crystal chamber printed in brass and I weathered it with aluminum black. After applying the solution to the desired amount, I removed it incrementally with a Scotch-Brite pad to achieve this look. I painted the crystal with black enamel paint, then after letting it dry, I scraped away the paint on all of the edges. There you can see the speaker mesh up close. I think it adds a really nice depth to the board chamber. The OLED display is a neat touch on this hilt. I wasn't sure if I would like it, but I think it does fit nicely with the overall look. After installing and swinging the hilt around a bit, I can honestly say I only have 2 major frustrations with it. The first thing is nothing to do with the design or manufacture of the hilt, but simply the limitations of the blade shape and materials. I wish the hilt was dual-worthy, like a nice thick-walled 1-inch blade, but the reality is that's just not possible, and I can accept that. I just really love using the sabers that I own. My other complaint is I believe the sound clarity and loudness could have been improved a bit had the chassis been designed to angle the speakers slightly towards the pommel. Anyone who owns an Ignition Saberco Mercury knows exactly what I mean. However, I'm not expecting it to perform to that standard, considering the Mercury also has quite a bit of space for resonance. I've considered the possibility of further discreetly venting the Darksaber hilt, and I haven't come to a conclusion on that yet. Overall, I really do love this saber. It's sleek, fairly easy to install, and the removable crystal chamber really does it for me. Now, pardon me while I go watch The Mandalorian with my new Darksaber. See you all next time.